We are going to be in the Gospel of John again. Last week we looked at a long story from John chapter 4, and this week we're going to look at a long story from John chapter 9. Before we get there, I have been reading this book, this book called Positively Irritating, and this is a book that's kind of about where the church finds itself, just like all Christians around kind of the Western world, Europe, the United States, in this time that we live in. And this author, John Rittner, was a missionary first in Europe. And if you know anything about Europe, you know that they are kind of like 20 or 30 years ahead of us in a lot of cultural really decline, right, in some ways. Church attendance there plummeted a long time ago, right? And so as a missionary there, people like him have kind of experienced firsthand what it's like to live in a kind of post-Christian culture. And now he's moved back to the United States and is dealing with the same kind of issues that he dealt with in Europe. So he starts this book with an illustration, and this illustration I found really helpful as we try to get our bearings in the world that we live in today. And it is about sand. I don't know if you've ever had sand blow into your eyes before. The only times I've been to the beach in my life are the times I've been on vacation, like many of you, right? We are a long way from the beach. But if you've been to the beach, you probably wouldn't have to spend very long getting that sensation, right, of sand blowing into your face. And it's not a great feeling, right? And you really, close your eyes to kind of avoid having sand actually get into your eye, right? Because that's kind of the worst. It really stings. And the reason it stings is because your body starts these different defensive actions to protect us and push the sand out, right? It's a little bit like the way our body deals with disease, right? All these different things kick in our body to get rid of the foreign object. Our eye starts to water, our eyelid starts to blink. We even use our hands, another part of our body, to get that foreign object out of there. We want to return to the way that things were before the sand ever got in there. And it makes sense, right? Because sand in your eye is bad. But there's something that's fascinating, that if the same grain of sand finds its way into an oyster in the ocean, a completely different response takes place. The oyster doesn't fight off the sand, it embraces the sand. It covers it with this like slimy goo. And over time, that goo kind of transforms into this coating around the sand, and something that was once an irritant has become something amazing that's actually really valuable, right? A pearl. And instead of the oyster trying to get back to the way it was before, it allows this new threat to become something that is actually used for good. And the key here is that only a healthy, mature oyster can actually do this mystical formation process in a way that doesn't hurt the oyster and actually promotes its health. And then also, of course, creates great value in the world. And so the author, Rittner, his point is that today we find ourselves as churches in kind of a similar sand storm, right? It's not just one piece of sand. It's like the whole storm is coming. And the church as an institution, right, is losing its privileged place. Again, this has happened in Europe much worse, but it is happening here increasingly at the local level and the federal level, right? We have less influence than we had before. We're not the first place that people look to for help or also for spiritual truth even, right? People have other ways that they find moral teaching for their children, right? All these kinds of ways we could talk about. People are not looking to the church as the primary center of society like they used to. And every church, right, no matter what the size is facing this reality blowing in our faces as we kind of look into the future. And of course, it would be easy to kind of view those challenges as grains of sand that we need to eliminate or resist in a way to try to get back to the way things were. But the truth is that there is no going back, right? The post-Christian Europe isn't going to become like medieval Europe again. right? It's not going to happen. But that's okay. We're never going to be able to get things back to the way they were before, but that doesn't mean there isn't hope. There is another option, right? We can embrace the challenges of our new world in the same way that the oyster embraces the sand. Instead of trying to expel the sand, we can have the opportunity to come around something that looks different, not by compromising with our culture, but about thinking about things differently, right? Having a spirit-filled imagination, a new way of looking at the world, and new practices that we kind of learn together and grow together in a new way of being the church. And if we're open to being changed and are willing to persevere, we can use the sand that's coming at us to become more like Jesus, which is and forever will be the goal of the church. So there's a story in John chapter 9 where Jesus confronts these three different groups, or one's an individual, two different groups of people who are all struggling to see the reality of their situation throughout this story. And Jesus will address each of them in different ways. So again, I'll warn you that this is a long passage, but just like the woman at the well story, the passage was written kind of as a whole, right? The story makes a lot of sense if we see it in its entirety. So I'm going to read all of John chapter 9, verses 1 to 41 this morning. So hang with me. I'm reading today from the New Living Translation, which kind of brings some life and everyday language to the scripture. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man who had been blind from birth. Rabbi, his disciples asked him, "Why was this man born blind? Was it because of his own sins or his parents' sins?" "It was not because of his sins or his parents' sins," Jesus answered. "This happened so that the power of God could be seen in him. We must quickly carry out the tasks assigned to us by the one who sent us. The night is coming and then no one can work. But while I am here in the world, I am the light of the world." Then he spit on the ground, made mud with the saliva, and spread the mud over the blind man's eyes. And then he told him, "Go wash yourself in the pool of Siloam." Siloam means sent. And so the man went and washed and came back seeing. His neighbors and others who knew him as a blind beggar asked each other, "Isn't this the man who used to sit and beg?" And some said he was, and others said, "No, he just looks like him." But the beggar kept saying, "Yes, I am the same one." They asked, "Who healed you? What happened?" And he told them, "The man they called Jesus made mud and spread it over my eyes and told me, 'Go to the pool of Siloam and wash yourself.' And so I went and washed, and now I can see." "Where is he now?" they asked. "I don't know," he replied. And then they took the man who had been blind to the Pharisees because it was on the Sabbath that Jesus had made the mud and healed him. And the Pharisees asked the man all about it. So he told them, "He put the mud over my eyes, then I washed it, and I could see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man Jesus is not from God, for he is working on the Sabbath." Others said, "How could an ordinary sinner do such miraculous signs?" So there was a deep division of opinion among them. Then the Pharisees again questioned the man who had been blind and demanded, "What's your opinion about this man who healed you?" The man replied, "I think he must be a prophet." The Jewish leaders still refused to believe the man had been blind and could now see, so they called in his parents, right? The plot thickens. They asked the parents now, "Is this your son? Was he born blind? If so, how can he now see?" And his parents reply, "We know this is our son and he was born blind, but we don't know how he can see or who healed him. Ask him. He's old enough to speak for himself." His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders who had announced that anyone that said Jesus was the Messiah would be expelled from the synagogue. That's why they said, "He is old enough, ask him." So for the second time, they called the man back in, the one who had been blind, and told him, "God should get the glory for this because we know this man, Jesus, is a sinner." "I don't know whether he is a sinner," the man replied, "but I know this, I was blind and now I can see." "But what did he do?" they asked. "How did he heal you?" "Look," the man exclaimed, "I told you once. Didn't you listen? Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too?" Then they cursed him and said, "You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know God spoke to Moses, but we don't even know where this man comes from." from?" "Why, that's very strange," the man replied. "He healed my eyes, and yet you don't know where he comes from. We know that God doesn't listen to sinners, but he's ready to hear those who worship him and do his will. Ever since the world began, no one has been able to open the eyes of someone born blind. If this man were not from God, he couldn't have done it." "You were born a total sinner," they answered. "Are you trying to teach us?" And then they threw him out of the synagogue. When Jesus heard what had happened, he found the man and asked, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" The man answered, "Who is he, sir? I want to believe in him." "You have seen him," Jesus said, "and he is speaking to you." "Yes, Lord, I believe," the man said, and he worshiped Jesus. Then Jesus told him, "I entered this world to render judgment, to give sight to the blind, and to show those who think they see that they are blind." Some Pharisees who were standing nearby heard him and said, "Are you saying we're blind? If you were blind, you wouldn't be guilty," Jesus replied, "but you remain guilty because you claim you can see." Thanks be to God for his written word. So this is another story where we get a very different understanding of what Jesus is doing here if we read the entire thing, right? If we had cut off the story after that initial interaction between Jesus and the blind man, it would have just been kind of another healing story. And not that there's anything wrong with healing stories at all, right? Those are great. But it's obvious because of what happens next that isn't actually the focus of the story that John is telling us. That just like with the woman at the well, there is a lot more to this story than just Jesus' interaction with one person. When you start reading the story, it's easy to think that the real problem is that this blind man can't physically see. And it's not just the blind man that thinks that's his problem, right? The disciples think that's the problem too. And as soon as they see him, right, they're asking, whose fault is it that this guy is physically blind? As if every problem has an obvious cause, right? Is it his parents' fault? Is it his own fault? Which is it, Jesus? But it quickly becomes clear that this is not the man's true problem because the story doesn't focus on this at all. The rest of the story is about a different kind of blindness. It's a metaphor, right? There is metaphorical blindness. Like a lot of times in John's gospel, he is using a metaphor for the entire thing to the point that it's almost painful, right? He's talking about blindness in a very metaphorical kind of way. It is spiritual blindness. And there are three, like I said earlier, three different sets of people who are having trouble seeing Jesus. So in the rest of the time, we'll kind of go through each of these one by one. So the first is the blind man who can't see Jesus, right? And this, of course, is obvious. The blind man can't see Jesus, obviously, literally, because he can't see anything. But even more than that, he is ignorant. He also has spiritual blindness, right? It's not that he has outright rejected God or Jesus. He just doesn't know who Jesus is. How could he know if no one has told him who Jesus is? Romans 10:13-15 is a famous passage that talks about this idea, right? For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. But how can they call on him to save them unless they believe in him? And how can they believe in him if they have never heard about him? And how can they hear about him unless someone tells them? And how will anyone go and tell them without being sent? That is why the scriptures say, how beautiful are the feet of messengers who bring good news. So just like the story we looked at last week, Jesus gives an example of what it looks like to tell other people the good news, right? Jesus is already doing what he hopes his disciples will do, right? John's gospel ends with this wonderful statement that I've used sometimes at the end of services where Jesus says, as the Father has sent me, I am sending you. And this is after he's given them the Holy Spirit, right? This is what Jesus is doing throughout the stories, right? Is he's like evangelizing is the word we might use, right? He's telling people about the good news of himself in advance of, right, the actual kind of resurrection and all of those things, because he's trying to give the disciples an example of what they can do. And so Jesus, I think, really is setting himself as, this is kind of the idea of what you should do too. Jesus sees the blind man. That's the first thing Jesus does. His disciples are, of course, asking an insensitive question, which we could spend an entire, half hour just talking about the disciples' question here, about the sin of the, who caused the blind man's sin. But the point really is that it's an insensitive question, and Jesus just ignores it, right? Jesus bends down, spits in the dirt, makes mud, and puts this mud, right, all over the blind man's eyes, which is pretty weird, right? I think most of us read this and are kind of like not sure exactly why he does this. And I think the point is symbolism. Again, we could go deep into that, but I think the symbolism here is that all throughout John's gospel, Jesus is not just giving us an example, he's also bringing new creation, right? He is the same one, the Word, who was with God from the beginning, like John chapter 1 tells us. So Jesus is bringing a new creation in the midst of the old one. And just like in Genesis chapter 2, God forms humans out of the dust of the ground, the dirt of the ground, Jesus here is using this dirt to recreate this man. And so with the mud over his eyes, the blind man then goes to the pool that Jesus has sent him to, and then he goes home seeing. So while it's possible that, God might want you to go to somebody and pray for their healing, and that certainly still happens today, and I've heard good stories that I can't recall offhand or I would tell you, but I know we've heard a story a couple weeks ago at the conference we're at about sometimes God gives these kinds of miracles as a doorway to preach the gospel, right? It still happens today. But even if God isn't going to give you the experience of having this kind of supernatural healing, the focus isn't on the physical healing, right? What Jesus is doing is meeting this man's needs. He doesn't walk up to the guy and start to try to evangelize him like a street evangelist would, right? Or a door-to-door salesman kind of thing. He doesn't try to scare the man about hell, right? And interestingly, about hell, Jesus only ever talks about hell in the Gospels to religious people and says they're the ones who are in danger of going there. But anyway, Jesus has compassion on this man, right? He meets the man where he's at with the most obvious need that he has, the physical need to see. And for the disciples and probably other people as well, the man is a theological problem, or he's just a society problem. Like, it's sad that we don't, who knows if they even thought this way back then, but they didn't have disability, right? This man isn't going to get government assistance. His only way he can survive is by begging, right? And so for Jesus, he is not a problem, right? He's not a theological problem. He's not a society problem. He is a person. And Jesus looks at him and has compassion on him and loves him. And he meets his need without attaching any string to it. And Jesus, interestingly, too, in this story, does not come back into the story until the very end, right? Jesus is there at the beginning and at the very end, the whole middle, there's no Jesus, right? After the formerly blind man, all in the middle of the story, is talking to a lot of other people about what Jesus does for him. But in the end of the story, Jesus comes to him after the man has been thrown out of the synagogue and is alone. And this is important, and we'll get to the thing about his parents in a minute, but this is important because they're afraid, right? And that they'll get thrown out of the community. And that is exactly what's happened to the blind man. The synagogue represents everything for them. It's like a church, but even more, right? It's the center of their society in the Jewish world. The man being thrown out of the synagogue is cutting him off from his own people. And so Jesus, once he sees this man now alone, comes again to meet his need and asks him, "Do you believe in the Son of Man, the Messiah?" And Jesus sees that the man doesn't have anybody belong to, and he is inviting the man into a new community of his disciples who are living this life with Jesus. And so, maybe if Jesus Jesus had asked the blind man right after he had healed him if he wanted to be his follower, maybe he wouldn't have been ready. We don't know. Maybe he would have been ready to receive what Jesus said. But I think it's very likely he would not, because through the story we see the blind man kind of having this progressive understanding of who Jesus is. Right? He starts out talking about him as a man, then he's a prophet, and by the end he's a man from God. Right? By the end he realizes these people, all these people surrounding, are trying to defend against Jesus instead of seeing the greatness of what Jesus is doing. And it makes him realize more and more Jesus is something special. He must be from God. And so when Jesus returns to him, his heart is ready, and the man is ready to do whatever Jesus asks. He says, Jesus says, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" The man's answer is so surrendering. He says, "Who is he, sir? I want to believe in him." Jesus, if you say so, I want to believe. He's ready to do whatever Jesus asks. And then, of course, Jesus says, "I am he. I'm the one speaking to you." And the man immediately says, "I believe," and worships him, something that no one has done really to this point in the Gospel of John. The second person then that is blind, is really a group of people, right? It's not one person, it's the whole Pharisees, right? And every time the Pharisees come up, as we do, for those of us who read the Bible a lot, it can be easy to automatically think, these are the bad guys, right? Like, these are the guys that don't know what's going on, and they're like the people I don't like, right? We think of somebody else as the Pharisee, right? But what I always want us to challenge us is that the Pharisee, in most of the stories that Jesus tells, at least at the first way, I should think about it as a long-time religious person who is part of the religious establishment, is to think of myself first, right? I'm the Pharisee, right? Before I try to make somebody else the Pharisee in the story, I should see whether that God has something to say to me as the Pharisee. The Pharisees can't see Jesus because they know how God works, and Jesus doesn't fit with how they understand God's work. And what's worse, and this is what's really sad in this story, is that they're not willing to change their minds. They're so hard-hearted that they not only miss the new thing that God is doing, they are obstinate, right? They will not change. Even when the man's parents give testimony that he's been blind from birth, they still don't believe. Even after the man tells them multiple times what has happened, they still won't believe. Their hearts are so closed off that they lash out at the blind man instead of recognizing the truth of what he's saying, the new way that God is working. And the Pharisees are insistent that they know this man, Jesus, is a sinner. And the man, of course, replies, "I don't know whether he's a sinner or not, but the one thing I know is that I was blind and now I see." He is willing to let his entire worldview be reshaped by what Jesus is doing. So the way that churches have looked over the last 2,000 years has been extremely different. This is one of those things I didn't think of growing up in church, right? I just think about how church looks for me, right? I just think about how we've done church, right? Or maybe the way my parents talked about them doing church, but our history goes back, for my parents, it's like the 1950s, right? It's not that long, right? There was 1,950 years, give or take, between my parents and Pentecost, right? There's a long history there of Christians trying to figure out what it means to be followers of Jesus. The early church would have met in homes, right? Fearful of persecution. At the very earliest, church would meet in the temple and in synagogues as well, but eventually they got cast out of those and had to kind of just meet in homes in hiding, right? And then eventually they were able to have designated worship spaces as they got that prominent place in society over the years, and then they kind of adapted different parts of the Roman Empire in the way they worshipped and the pomp and circumstance, right? And then later they built the amazing cathedrals that we think of many are still standing in Europe to this day, right? All these different kinds of forms of worship And then even in what we think of maybe the kind of rebirth of Christianity with the Reformation, we would have no idea what to do if we walked into a service that Martin Luther was presiding over, right? Or John Calvin was presiding over, or even John Wesley, right? They were very high church, strict liturgy people, right? Very different than how we do church, right? Of course, music has changed as well through the ages. Most of the songs we've written, we sing, right, are ones that have only been written in the last 100, 200 years at the most. So it's okay that things are changing still today because they've always changed. The important thing is that people are able to gather together and worship Jesus as Lord. And I just talked about the kind of time that's changed. The place, it changes from place to place to place, right? The way our church looks isn't the way that church looks in South Asia or Eastern Europe, right? The way that people do church always is changing, and it will always continue to change until Jesus returns. And so the question that Jesus asks us is, are we open, right? Are we open to the ways that God is working in our time and our place? And especially if we've been wrong about this in the past. Because that's what the Pharisees do, like I said. It's not just that they're wrong, it's that they're not even willing to listen and admit that they might have been wrong in the past. And they just keep doubling down over and over again on the problem until eventually they kill Jesus because they don't want to listen to him, right? They're tired of hearing from him. Even though they probably knew deep down they were wrong, right? It's hard to imagine that they didn't realize they were wrong, because some of the Pharisees did. Some of the Pharisees did understand. In John's gospel, it's Nicodemus. He finally gets it, right? But the truth is, it's really hard to do that, because the vast majority of Pharisees, and maybe a lot of the Jews in general, didn't see the new thing God was doing, and they did double down on ignoring Jesus. So it takes a level of humility. Will we admit that God might have been trying to do something new and we've missed it? And if we admit it, we can admit it before it's too late, which again is what someone like Nicodemus did. Nicodemus becomes one of the first followers of Jesus. So the last group of blind people in the story are the disciples. And I don't think it's bad usually to see ourselves as the disciples too. They are often clueless and can bring us humility as well. They can't see Jesus in this story because they're so distracted by the problem right in front of them. All right, they ask, who sinned? Was it this man or his parents? Jesus knows it's not either of them, right? And he's not going to get bogged down in this question. The disciples are too worried about this abstract problem rather than the person that is literally standing in front of them. So as I think about the disciples, who really end up pushed to the side, right? They're not involved in this story really at all because they're not in on what's happening, right? They have no idea what Jesus is doing again. And as I kind of think about the disciples kind of off to the side, not seeing the new thing that God is doing in Jesus and just having to watch because they can't understand and join in, I've been kind of convicted myself, right? As leaders in the church, we can become so focused on our own problems that we don't see Jesus either. Maybe you can relate, right? Whether it's as a church or even as individuals, right? It can be hard to look to Jesus because all we see are the problems bearing down on us. The problems are kind of right front of sight. They're blocking our view of everything else. I was thinking about it this morning as maybe we're in a foxhole, right? At least it feels like it sometimes. And we are having all these enemies coming at us, right? And we're sitting in a foxhole. All the enemies are coming at us. All we can see in our line of sight is these enemies bearing down on us. And we let them block our view of Jesus, who we imagine is out there past the enemies. But in reality, Jesus is standing there in the foxhole with us, if we have the eyes to see. And if we can't see Jesus right with us, how are we ever going to see the people in need that he sent our way, maybe even some of those same people that we see as the enemies coming towards us? So this morning I am going to wrap up probably earlier than we normally do, but I want to give us time to listen this morning to God's Spirit. We don't have, like I said, we got extra time this morning, so you don't have to rush. And I think it's really cool. God's Spirit will speak to us as individuals, and I hope that you set aside time during the week to do that. But I think it's cool sometimes to be able to do that in a place with other believers, because I do think God wants to meet us together as well. And so I want us to sit with a question for a few minutes. And this question is kind of vague on purpose. It is about the pearl out of sand, right? How might God want to make pearls out of sand in your life, in our world, in our church, in your relationships, in your family, right? Maybe there's a situation that feels difficult, and all you can see is the problem, and in reality, Jesus is trying to do something. Maybe, in fact, he is doing something, and we're just not seeing it. The sand is legitimately hurting people at times, right? It's not totally wrong to see the sand as an irritant, right? That's where the analogy that I used at the beginning breaks down a little bit, right? Because for the pearl, the sand isn't going to hurt the pearl, right? Maybe you already, or the oyster, right? Maybe you were already thinking that, right? So it isn't a perfect analogy, certainly, but I do think that maybe if I stretch this analogy too far, I would say that God wants to make us into an oyster, right? He wants to take us from a human eye to an oyster so that we can actually become something, a person who can repackage this difficulty into something that works in a new day and time. If you're just realizing that God is trying to make a pearl from the sand, it's not too late. That is the other great hope, right? The Pharisees, it ended up being too late. But if they had turned at this moment, they had lots of moments still where they still could have turned before it was too late, right? And we all have more chances. We don't know when those chances are up, but we know we do have a chance even here this morning. You don't have to keep doubling down. So again, as you feel led, you can sit there in your pew, you can come to the altar, you can sit on a front pew. But maybe there's a part of the story that stuck out to you and you felt like God was speaking to you and you want to open the scripture in front of you and reflect on. Maybe there's something that comes to your mind that you don't want to think about as soon as you see that sentence. But I'll just give a few moments for us to reflect together, and then I'll come up and pray, and then have the worship team come for the last song. Let's just spend a moment in prayer.